Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. My name is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and today I'll be presenting the initial material for this workshop along with my colleagues Michaela Freeman and Deborah Rose. This workshop is around supporting decision-making for environmental effects of marine energy. And just right at the top of this, particularly for those from many countries, we really are talking about marine energy in terms of wave and tidal largely. This does not include offshore wind, and that's just somewhat of a feature of the way our programs are put together at the international and the US level. But we hope that many of these lessons and products are also useful for those of you who are looking at applications for offshore wind. Next slide, please. All right, today's webinar, what we're trying to do is we're trying to continue an engagement we've been carrying on with the marine energy community for some time. But today we're really trying to gear what we're talking about, and the people who are on here we've invited really represent the regulatory and advisory community, because we think that the MRE community is much larger than this, but this is really trying to be for you. We want to share the tools and resources that we have been developing over the last number of years that we hope will help with decision-making for applications for permits or consents. And we really, probably point 3 is most important. We'd like feedback on the efforts. This is a workshop put on by Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we have produced what we've called guidance documents that will help understand how these can be applied and how they might be useful to you in your everyday work. And so we really are interested in what you think here. Okay, next slide, please. So for today, we're going to do this introduction and background. I'm going to talk very briefly about OES-Environmental and some of the efforts we've been working at over the past decades in terms of risk retirement and data transferability, and introduce this moving from the science into consenting language. At that point, I'll turn it over to Michaela, who will talk about the guidance documents and the background. Debbie will then talk about the country-specific and stressor-specific guidance documents and the various pieces that make those up. And then we'll make sure we've got time in these breakout groups for feedback and discussion. And we'll wrap up at an hour and a half right on time with what we intend to do in terms of next steps. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned we are representing OES-Environmental. This is a task under the International Energy Agency group known as Ocean Energy Systems. We were tasked starting back in 2010, and we've been running continuously since then, to look at environmental effects of marine energy in order to advance this industry in a responsible manner. Each task under OES is led by a country. In this case, it's the US, and it is the US Department of Energy's Water Power Technology Office who is the lead, along with 2 of our other federal agencies, NOAA and BOEM, and it is implemented by our laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Lab. We currently have 16 members participating, and you can see the flags down there. So it's a really broad-based group across North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. And the biggest output we provide in each of what we call phases, 4-year phases, is a State of the Science report. The most recent one came out in September of 2020. There's the cover of it, and it can all be found on TETHIS. You see the URL for TETHIS Environmental, OES Environmental at the top there, and we'll be sharing these URLs throughout. And this is a pretty comprehensive 300-page document. Many of you are probably familiar with it. If you're not, I would suggest you might take a look. Next slide. Okay, getting into the meat a little. We're talking ocean renewable energy. This is energy harvested from waves, tides, other moving water such as persistent ocean currents, and also temperature and salinity gradients. But as most of you know, wave and tidal are really the technologies that are leading here and the ones you're likely to come up against in terms of consenting. This industry is very much in the early stage of development, deployment, and early commercialization, with the first truly commercial tidal farm at Maygen in the north of Scotland put in just a couple of years ago. And we're really not getting past that initial commercialization at the moment. We know that environmental concerns are continuing to slow consenting worldwide. After a decade of looking at this, we've come down to these 7 key stressors, those parts of systems that are likely to cause concern or damage or injury and death to marine organisms and habitats. And they include collision risk, risk of underwater noise. Here we're talking really about operational noise, not so much installation. Effects of electromagnetic fields on animals, particularly from export electrical cables, changes in both benthic and pelagic habitat. There are stakeholder concerns about mooring line encounters with large animals. At larger scale, changes in oceanographic systems, that is, changes in circulation and wave height. And we're just beginning to look at what will happen as we get to larger arrays in terms of displacement of animals, either migratory animals or those making smaller movements, say on the seafloor, what happens when they encounter these systems. So those are sort of the bins in which we look at these. Next slide, please. So we have been spending some time talking about what we call risk retirement and data transferability. And by data transferability, we mean what is a mechanism for taking existing data sets, information, and so on that has been collected at already consented sites, from research projects, or from analogous industries, and applying it to new applications. Go ahead and click through that. Yeah. And we have developed a system that should make it much easier for regulators and advisors to find these data sets and apply them appropriately. And this is all part of what we've called risk retirement. Now, this seems to be a bit of a loaded term. By risk retirement, we mean that for certain waiver tidal installations, usually small ones, sort of 1 to 4 devices, it's probably not necessary to investigate every one of those 7 interactions that I mentioned, the stressor interactions with animals and habitats, but rather to rely on existing data with the understanding that we cannot replace or contradict any regulatory process. And if we consider a risk retired, it can certainly be re-examined and should be as we move to larger scale. And that there will always be a need for some site-specific data collection when you go to have a new project. What we are trying to do is have a systematic manner of decreasing the amount of sort of reinventing the wheel, reproving the same kinds of interactions are not significant. We've worked through a process with the research community and others to look at several of these interactions that we consider could be retired for small numbers of devices. And all of this can be found on those TETHIS links at the bottom for risk retirement and data transferability. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, let's pause here. If there are any questions around what I've presented so far, especially about risk retirement and data transferability. So if anyone's got questions, please either unmute yourself or raise your hand. Type in the chat. So far, so good, I guess. Okay, so this is really the basis of what we've been working on the last several years, and we've done several webinars on the sort of digging into the specifics of data transferability and data and risk retirement that you can find on TETHIS. But what we're going to delve into a little more today is this. We have worked on the State of the Science report. We have pulled together evidence bases and so on. But this really is the science end of it. And it is not always in the most convenient or accessible means for looking at consenting processes. So from these available data and information, a State of the Science report, there's also a brochure, which is sort of a State of the Science light, if you will, pictured there. We have pulled together the most relevant scientific papers and information, worked through our risk retirement and data transferability processes, and moved that into what we consider the most appropriate language for consenting. And we call these guidance documents, as shown there on the right. And the bulk of this presentation is going to be about these guidance documents. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Michaela to pick up the details.
Thanks, Andrea. So yeah, as Andrea's mentioned, we've been working on this for quite some time now. And so I just want to talk quickly about what these were built for, and then we'll get into the details of what they actually entail. So the guidance documents were really developed for regulators who are consenting and licensing projects, advisors who are assessing the information and then informing regulators, and developers as they're preparing these fit-for-purpose applications. Each component is really designed to move from the scientific evidence to application within a regulatory context. And one of the main goals is to make information easily accessible and readily available. It's really important to note that the guidance documents, they don't replace any regulation or national guidance, but they're meant to be a useful tool within these processes. The guidance documents themselves are organized by categories of regulation, and they include an overview for applying these concepts in a regulatory process. So if you'll click next on this slide, Debbie, there are 3 types of guidance documents, and this really includes a background document that provides the context for this effort. It explains the purpose and the application of the information, the description of the regulatory categories that we used in a framework for application. There's also country-specific documents, which Debbie will talk about, and these are developed for each of the participating OES-Environmental countries, produced by those country representatives. These really aim to provide the regulations and relevant efforts for each country for marine renewable energy environmental effects consenting, and they're really intended primarily for developers to understand the requirements in the different countries. Lastly, there's stressor-specific documents, which Debbie will also cover, and these present an overview of each stressor receptor interaction that Andrea mentioned, and they link to available data and information and detail where we're at with risk retirement. So I'm going to walk through starting with a little bit of progress on where we are to date. So this is kind of how the scheme of the guidance documents are together and where we're at. We've completed the background document up at the top right, shown by the yellow check marks are any documents we've completed so far. We've also been working our way through the different stressor receptor interactions. So we have documents so far for underwater noise, for electromagnetic fields, for habitat change and oceanographic system. And shown by those little gears in blue, our team is working on guidance documents for entanglement and for collision risks that are currently in the review process right now. We also have several of the country documents completed and several more draft version, but we do plan to develop these for all the OES environmental countries. And those shown in gray will start drafting once we're completed the above pieces. Next slide, please. So as far as the background document goes, we use 4 regulatory categories as the basis of moving between talking about scientific evidence and how we apply that for consenting and licensing processes. So as Andrea introduced us to, the marine energy community tends to talk about these stressor receptor interactions, but through talking with the regulatory community, such as yourselves, over the years, we understand that, of course, your responsibility is governed by the legislations and regulations you're responsible for. And so we've tried to categorize what those are, again, working within 16 different countries, so trying to use language that's applicable throughout all of these different countries. And so we've come up with the following 4 categories that we've discussed with our OES environmental country representatives and regulators and advisors, and we think that these fit well and are applicable internationally. So the 4 countries are species and or population at risk, habitat alteration or loss, effects on water quality, and effects on social and economic systems. So within the background document, and it includes an explanation of each of these 4 categories, as well as information that's relevant for consenting processes, such as baseline information needs for each of the categories, and potential risks for those category, aligning those with stressor receptor interactions. And it also includes some information on risk retirement within each category, and a brief additional note on caveats and things like cumulative effects. So in the next slide, I'm going to give us an example of what this actually looks like and what that information contains. So I'll use the example of species and/or populations at risk. So we've defined this as species, populations, and/or subpopulations that are protected under legislations or regulations, terms such as endangered, threatened, vulnerable. And this can also include species that are commercially, recreationally, or culturally valuable as well. So within this, we've included what baseline data might be useful to collect here, and that's data that can be required within this category includes data to inform if species live in or migrate through an area, if they may be affected by the development itself. And specifically, that may include characteristics of species, so species distribution, population size, life history, and behavior, among a few, and characteristics of the marine renewable energy project site. So species diversity and abundance might be 2 of those. And information here will really aid site selection, and it will help to minimize or manage site and technology specific risks. Under the risks identified for this category, this includes collision risk, underwater noise impacts, change in habitat, and electromagnetic fields impacts. And these are all the different species, some such as collision risk to marine mammals, fish, diving birds, and sea turtles. Others like EMF impacts to sensitive species such as fish, elasmobranchs, sea turtles, and possibly invertebrates. Additional risks include entanglement of marine mammals, large sharks, and sea turtles within the water column cables and mooring lines, and then displacement from areas with large arrays. So the last piece in the background document is the framework. And we've developed this to really show the application of the guidance documents within consenting processes. This is not new to you as you all work within these processes, but it identifies the different aspects of consenting, including who's responsible for each step. And we've also noted throughout the framework, as you can see on the left here, where these concepts such as risk retirement and data transferability can be used. So we've noted here that risk retirement may be useful in project scoping as you're trying to identify what are the potential impacts that you're looking at, and consultation that a developer is engaging with a regulator and advisor. Another step where this might be useful is as you're evaluating information for environmental assessments, data transferability might come into play there, where you may be able to use data from a previous marine renewable energy project to inform your project that is currently being consented. So I do want to note that this framework I'm showing on this slide is a super simplified version of what's actually in the guidance document. So I do recommend taking a look at the document to see the full version of this. And as I mentioned before, we've tried to create this framework so that it's applicable internationally and uses language that's relevant across all the countries. So it is a simplified version of consenting processes, but we hope that it includes enough detail to guide users through the application of these concepts from project scoping to the end of project licensing. So with that, I am going to pause for a second and take a moment to see if there are any questions you may have on anything presented so far, the introduction of the guidance documents, the background document, or even risk retirement and data transferability. And as you're thinking through questions, questions you may have for us, we've also noted questions that we have for you on this slide. We won't be discussing these now. We'll actually be discussing them during the breakout groups at the end of the presentations. But I wanted to show them now to get you thinking about the kind of feedback that we're looking for. So do the regulatory categories make sense? How could the framework be useful for consenting processes? How might risk retirement and data transferability be helpful, or have you already applied these concepts in practice? So keep those, in the back of your mind as we're going through today, and we'll show these questions again for actual discussion later. But I'm going to pause and stop talking for a second and see if anyone has questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat or hear anyone, so I am going to pass it on to Debbie, who's going to walk us through the rest of the guidance documents.
Perfect. Thanks, Michaela. So the next part of the guidance documents that we want to highlight are these country-specific documents. And as Michaela mentioned, these are intended for developers to use. So I'll just give a quick overview here, as they're likely less relevant for your roles. And the goal, again, is to develop these for each of the OES-Environmental countries, working with the existing country representatives to do so. So these documents include information on regulatory jurisdictions, agencies, or regulatory bodies with jurisdiction over MRE projects, key regulations or statutes for environmental effects based on the 4 categories, and additional relevant information such as on marine spatial planning or adaptive management. We want to note that these documents are not meant to be comprehensive of all the regulations and details that exist in each of the countries, but rather provide an overview of the jurisdiction and regulation layout that can help guide a developer who is putting a project in the water in a particular country context. The last piece of the guidance documents, and where I'm going to spend the most of my time chatting today, is on the stressor-specific documents, which bring together current knowledge on stressor receptor interactions to make the data and information easily accessible in kind of a short form format. So far, we've developed stressor documents for 4 interactions, as Michaela mentioned in that progress chart: underwater noise, electromagnetic fields, habitat change, and changes in oceanographic systems. Each document includes background information on the interaction, links to existing data and information, and some information on the pathway to risk retirement and the recommendations. So today, I'm going to walk through the specifics of these documents by showing an example using the habitat change document. And the document is available on TSIS if you'd like to follow along or just review later in the discussion sections. So the background section of the document provides an overview of the interaction and connects it to the regulatory category, which in this case is easy: habitat alteration or loss. As you may know, structures placed in the marine environment, including MRE devices, have the potential to lead to habitat alteration, loss, or creation. MRE devices may be attached or anchored to the seafloor, as well as placed in the water column, potentially impacting both benthic and pelagic environments. This may occur due to sediment trenching or digging for cable installation, contributing to local disturbance, loss of habitat immediately under the foundations, anchors, or cables, creation of new hard substrate habitat that can be colonized by many organisms and may attract mobile organisms, and the possible marine reserve effect due to closures of areas surrounding MRE devices to other human activities. So the document contains references and links to multiple other sources of existing information on the stressor, the TSIS knowledge base, the 2020 State of the Science chapter, and today we'll focus on the evidence bases and the monitoring datasets discoverability matrix. And we've done a lot of presentations on some of these tools before, so they may seem familiar. And if this kind of quick overview isn't comprehensive enough, please note that we do have lots of other information available to guide you through using any of these tools. So the evidence bases contain key research papers, monitoring reports, and documents that could inform risk retirement for small numbers of devices. The evidence bases have been compiled for multiple interactions, and each evidence base either has been or will be reviewed and discussed by experts through international conferences or online workshops, as well as expert consultations. The habitat change evidence base in particular contains 60 documents that were reviewed in an online expert forum in August 2020, and some of these are highlighted within the stressor-specific guidance document. Next, I want to just quickly show the monitoring datasets discoverability matrix, which is an interactive online tool to guide data transfer. The matrix identifies characteristics to help easily find relevant data, and each set of characteristics is specific to the interactions, but generally include the stressor, which today we're talking about habitat change, the receptor, the site condition, the technology type, and the project size. The matrix allows users to choose an interaction and define characteristics based on your data needs, providing results that are relevant, for example, for regulators trying to consent or developers aiming to submit an application. So when you go to the matrix, you can see the 6 interactions at the top. There are 2 for habitat change to differentiate between changes to benthic habitat and those within the water column. And I'm here going to be looking at the habitat change water column tab to provide an example of how it works. So down in the gray area, you can see the different characteristics for this interaction, including the stressor, the receptor, the technology subtype, and the support structure. So for this example, let's say we're interested in finding information relevant for a project that is bottom mounted, and it also has mooring lines and a gravity base, and we're interested in fish as the main receptor. So once you make these selections and open up the tree, you'll click the View Results button at the top. And then you get to this page with some output. The output is a list of baseline and post-installation monitoring results. Those are from our existing metadata project sites. And it'll have also a list of relevant metadata pages and research studies, and a list of key documents from the evidence base for habitat change. And you can then click on any of these titles to explore the details of the data sets. All right, lastly, I just want to chat through the management measures tool, which is also featured in the guidance documents now under that tools and existing information. The management measures tool has been recently updated and provides a collection of methods that have either been used or tried for MRE projects related to compliance, design, mitigation, or monitoring. And it is intended for regulators and developers to search for what has been tried to reduce remaining risks related to a deployment, to facilitate the sharing of lessons learned and move toward best practices. You can search, filter, or download the information. And this here is just a screenshot from the tool, filtering by the habitat loss subcategory. And here you can see that the design feature employed was micrositing to avoid sensitive habitats. And in cases where it's available, the implications and advantages of each measure are noted, as well as any citations or project documents to find more information. The last section in the stressor-specific documents is the pathway to risk retirement. So this section really summarizes the level of risk based on the evidence base and any consensus building activities that OES-Environmental has conducted with experts in the scientific community. For habitat change, the evidence to date suggests that impacts from small-scale MRE developments are limited, likely to only affect a limited area around a device, dissipate quickly or recover quickly from disturbances, or create new habitats, providing a positive effect. Severe habitat change can be avoided or mitigated through identification and avoidance of fragile, unique, or important habitats during site selection. The expert forum we hosted concluded that risks from habitat change for small numbers of devices can be retired when sited properly. And this means that extensive studies at each new project site may not be needed to assess impacts, provided that a suitable baseline study is conducted. However, any data on impacts that is collected can continue to inform the broader research community's understanding of cumulative effects related to habitat change.
Okay, so just to give you a little sense of some of the things we've been doing and trying to think about in terms of these guidance documents, doing some outreach. These things are only useful if people know where they are and are able to look at them. We have been working with the OES-Environmental country representatives. Each of the 16 countries has a rep, several of whom are on the call here today. We have really just started on this international regulator review. We've been started with US regulators and advisors, and we did a series of workshops last February with them. Same with some of the UK regulators and advisors, and more broadly, the Welsh Advisory Community. We talked with specifically in June of 22, and then we've got this workshop today. We've got another one later in our day for Asia, Oceania, and we are really interested including these, think it's important that the regulatory and advisory community is aware and can provide the best feedback possible before we really try to get these out further, and especially more directed outreach to the developer community. So next slide, please. So just a couple of things I want to note for you, some resources. This, we've called it a brochure. It's actually about a 16-page book. This is what I called State of the Science Light. This really was created as an introduction to environmental effects of marine renewable energy, particularly to be useful to the new regulators that I know so many countries are bringing on board. There is a spread for each of these major stressor individual stressors and a small case study where this has been applied. And I think that you'll find it somewhat useful. There is the link, and Doria, I assume, is going to put that in the chat as well. So you might want to take a look at that. It's downloadable. We've tried to make it really pretty and accessible. Next slide, please. I think many of you may be familiar with TETHIS, which is our online knowledge management system that's got in the order of 4,000 plus documents related directly to marine renewables. There's also wind energy information on there, so it's considerably bigger than that, both land-based and offshore wind environmental effects. So if you're not familiar, or just as a reminder, there's lots of information there. And what you're seeing on the right-hand screenshot is under tools, some of the tools that we mentioned here, and that's where you can find all of those if you didn't catch the URLs. And I do want to note that we talked a little bit about data in my group and the way that we can really pull different data sets together, including those from regulatory processes, but things that developers are collecting, because this is how we're really going to move forward, is in these sort of analyses of bringing together data sets. And I just wanted to note on the left-hand side, this is the data system we've set up in the US. We have the luxury, to some extent, of not having a super active sector at this point, but the opportunity with Department of Energy funds to set up a data system. So we really are capturing everything that's been created. We call it PRIMER, Portal and Repository for Information on Marine Renewable Energy. Yeah, we love acronyms. And it really is set up with 7 knowledge hubs. You see TETHIS over there at about 8 o'clock. TETHIS Engineering right above it is a sister site that does the same thing as TETHIS, but for the engineering and technology side of it. The MHK Data Repository above it is the actual data sets are housed there. The Marine Energy Atlas is our geographic information system. It's largely resource characterization data right now. And I do want to note that we are in the process of updating OES, Ocean Energy Systems database, GIS database, and that will be linked in here as well. Telesto's a whole group of guidance on measurement and instrumentation. It's largely not environmental. It's largely around resource characterization and power performance, but we are adding as available, the environmental information in there. And then down here, the MRE Marine Energy Software is what it says. It's models and codes and so on. And the last one down about 7 o'clock, Marine Energy Projects Database is still being updated, though it's pretty robust now. And we have tried to capture internationally all the marine energy projects that exist. And that allows you to go in and look for types of technology, tidal versus wave projects, see the companies. You can search by company, by whether it's been deployed at a test center anywhere in the world, and so on. So that should be a somewhat useful tool. You can go in and search. The data repository is, and the Marine Atlas at this point are only US. Everything else here is international and contains as much as we can around the world. So it's just sort of a way that we're going about it, trying to get there. And one of the things we've been doing is holding workshops for data sharing internationally. So we're trying to kind of put a little influence on getting those data sets in at the right time, so that these kind of analyses can be done in future. Next slide, please. Okay, just a few other resources, some of which you may be familiar with. The Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Program, ORJEP, out of the UK, we work with our partner Aquaterra on that. They lead that, and that's got a lot of really useful information, including a series of environmental information notes that were developed for whales. Delft has put in the Netherlands has put together a really useful set of tutorials on marine energy. It's quite an investment of time to go in and work through them, but they're really good. A couple of tools that are coming out of Spain, ASTI's WEC ERA tool and VAPM. These are ecological risk assessment and marine spatial planning tools, and we are planning a workshop with those to showcase some of those along with some of our tools, including the management measures tool in January, I believe. And finally, I want to note Marine Renewable, Offshore Renewable Energy Lab's MORE-EST platform there as well. I'm sure there are some others that you would find useful, and we have some very US specific ones, but these are the ones that I think are most useful internationally. So if there's other tools you found helpful, we'd love to know about it. And because we are trying to more and more sort of make a little bit of a directory of these. All righty, so just to finally wrap up, we are interested as OES-Environmental in moving the marine renewable energy industry forward, doing it responsibly. And first and foremost, what is really tripping us all up now, I think, is we need more devices in the water so we can collect data around them, so we can test our hypotheses and validate our numerical models. There's only so far you can go on paper, as it were. So what we've been trying to do to contribute to this is publicly sharing all available information through TESIS, through Primer. We think that making sure there's no knowledge lost is incredibly important, not just for where we are now, but for where we're going in future. We are sharing best practices for avoiding and minimizing harm. That's our management measures tool. And trying to systematically use data collected at existing sites for new sites through data transferability and risk retirement. And finally, making this science accessible for regulatory use through the guidance documents and this new MRE sort of simple state of the science brochure. So I think that is it. Am I correct? Oh, next steps. Yeah, thank you. So we do have a post-workshop survey. We'd like to have you take. You'll see that on the next slide. And please go back and review the Jamboards and add to them, because I know there wasn't much time to do that. We will continue. We are committed to continuing to engage with the regulatory community, and any suggestions you have of how to bring your colleagues into this. Can we provide additional briefings? Are there materials that you're not seeing we could consider putting into our work program? And if you haven't already, please do sign up for TESIS Blast, which is our every other week email newsletter that tells you what's new on TESIS. It's got news and information from the industry, conferences, workshops, upcoming, and we've even getting job listings more and more now. So please feel free to do that. And again, Dory's put that in there. So we are really interested in your feedback. If you have any direct feedback you'd like to give us right now, we'd love to hear about it. And at the least, if you don't mind taking your smartphone and directing it towards that QR code, Dory's also going to put it in the chat. We'd love to have you do our quick survey to give a sense of whether this workshop was useful to you, what was useful, what you'd like to hear about next. We'd like to thank you very much for spending your time with us today. Everybody's being bombarded with lots of online opportunities. And on behalf of Michaela and Debbie and the rest of our team, thank you very much. Please reach out to us anytime with information, with feedback, etc.